Hello, this is another Pacesetter training video on dealing with fencing. What I'd like to talk about today in this video is mainly getting the point across of dealing with ownership of fencing. And we will write a little bit here, kind of explain a little bit how we need to notate that when we're writing in our estimate. And then we'll take a look at this diagram and talk about a few things that we might see out in the field. So if you look at this diagram, this is kind of a typical house with a fence with four sides. We're going to say that this is in a typical neighborhood with neighbors on each side of our insured's property on all three sides, right, back, and left. And then we're going to say we have some damage to all four sides. We're just going to randomly pick some measurements and things like that when we write. But we're going to repair the front and right, which is owned by the insured. We're going to also repair the back, which is co-owned by the insured. And then we're going to replace the entire left run, which is co-owned by the insured. So let's talk about ownership. So typically, fences in neighborhoods are installed by the contracting firms that build all the houses, and then the plats are tracked out, by the city. Typically, the fencing is installed on the property line that is dividing the properties. It's typically installed right on the property line. If that's the case, unless the insured can provide you with documentation that you can provide in the file showing that that fence or one of the fences are installed inside that property line on their property, then the insurance looks at that fence as being co-owned by the insured and the neighbor equally. They own the fence 50%. That even applies to fencing that is put up by the insured. Let's say a few years earlier, you get out and the insured tells you a few years earlier they replace the back fence at their cost. And that fence is installed directly on the property line. And now you're out there with an inspection and we have some damage to that back fence. As far as the insurance policy is concerned, that fence is still co-owned, even though the insured paid to replace that fence or put a new fence up. Maybe the old fence was deteriorated and they just wanted to put a new fence up. It's still considered co-owned based on the insurance policy, which means that when you are writing something on each run of a fence that is co-owned, you are actually only going to write 50% of the damages. So in other words, on this left run that we're going to replace, it's 50 feet long. We're going to notate and photograph that all the fencing over here is damaged on this run to let everybody know that, yes, the entire fence is damaged, it needs to be replaced, but you're actually only going to write 50% of the damage. So you'll write 25 feet of fencing on the left. The idea is that the insured's neighbor over here, they should be filing a claim, and that adjuster should also be paying for 50% of this roof so that both parties can put their insurance proceeds together and get the entire fencing replaced or repaired. So that's kind of the way it works. Again, the main thing is where is the fence installed? Now, again, in normal neighborhoods, where we have properties right next to each other, houses built right next to each other with fencing everywhere, typically these wood slat fences, very common. All of those fences are going to be installed on the property lines. So we're going to have a lot of co-owned fencing, typically on the right, the back, and the left sides. The front, of course, very commonly split on each side of the house. We may have a gate on one side, of course, to get into the property in the back. Both of the front sides are going to be owned 100% by the insured, of course, because those two fences are installed on their property, on their lot. Now, if you have, let's say, the back is an empty lot that's not owned, let's say it's a park or something, well, you could probably go ahead and pay for 100% of that fence if that's the case. Typically, it could be argued that the city owns that. Maybe there's a sidewalk back here. Typically, you can probably go ahead and pay for 100%. you may want to get around the back, take a couple of pictures, show what's going on back here, and then maybe get with your manager or the desk adjuster and just get some clarification on how they want you to proceed with writing that particular fencing. So again, just keep in mind about where it's installed. You could get out on a property and the insured says, oh no, the fencing is installed on my property. We had it specifically installed and moved. Okay, that's fine. The insured needs to provide you with some type of verification of that, some type of documentation, a city plat. Maybe there's some markers, normal markers of where the city marked where it would normally have been installed, but the fence is actually installed 6 inches inside that towards the insured's property. If you can gather any documentation that you can get, photograph, or that you can get from the insured to verify that the fence may be installed on their property, yes, absolutely do that, and then include that in the file so that you can pay for 100% of that fencing. One thing you may want to keep in mind too, it's not too common, but you will see it out there, and you should take a look. Anytime you're going to replace or repair any fencing that you know is not owned by the insured or could be co-owned by the insured, take a look over the fence. Maybe reach up with your camera and take a shot down the fence line, pointing down the fence line, because oftentimes, I'd say often, it's not that often, but it does happen. It's why you want to take a photo. The neighbor may have installed another fence just inside the fence that you're looking at that's damaged. So let's say the insured has a wood slat fence. It's 6 feet tall. And this neighbor to the right, where this little green line is, has installed a 4-foot chain link fence, and it's 6 inches from this wood fence. If you weren't paying attention and didn't know that, you may consider this co-owned of this wood fencing that may be damaged, and you would only pay the insured for 25% of the damages, when in fact we would owe 100% of this fence damage to the insured in that case, because the neighbor has their own fence, which now makes this fence owned by our insured. So just keep an eye on that kind of stuff. It's always a good idea to reach up. Again, you don't have to climb up, get your ladder or anything. Just kind of reach up, point your camera parallel right down the fence line, aiming down a little bit so we can see both sides. Take a picture of each run so we can kind of tell what's going on. Good way to document that stuff. Okay, so let's go kind of write this. And the reason why we want to look about writing it and dealing with ownership is that we want to usually put some kind of F9 note to let the insured and their contractor know about the ownership, whether it's owned by the insured or co-owned by the insured per run, because that can vary. As we can see here, the front and the right runs are owned by our insured. Of course, the front 2 runs here are on the property of the insured. There's no question there. That's owned by the insured. This right run we just talked about is owned by the insured because of this neighbor's fence right here, this little green line. However, the back and the left runs are co-owned by our insured. So we're only going to pay for 50% of the damages. So I wrote a little mock damage scenario here. We're going to repair the front and the right, even though, excuse me, even though it's owned by the insured, we're just going to make repairs. There's not enough damage to replace. We're also going to say that the fencing is stained. So we're going to repair the front and the right, so we'll pay for 100% of that damage on those 2 runs. We're also going to repair the back. Since that's co-owned, we're going to only pay for 50% of that damage. And then we're going to replace the entire left run, but again, because that left run is co-owned, we're only going to pay for 50% of this run, which would be 25 feet of fencing. Then we're going to stain the fence. One thing before we go in and look at the estimate, on stain, keep in mind that even though fence runs, for instance, the back and the left are co-owned by our insured, if those fences are stained and we're going to stain the fence, you would pay for 100% of the fencing stain on the inside of that fence. Why? Because that stain on the insured side of the fence is 100% owned by the insured. The fence itself sits on the property line. That's shared. That's co-owned. But the fence has two sides that can be stained. So we wouldn't stain the other side of the, excuse me, the other side of the fence, obviously. That's the neighbor's side. We're not responsible for that. But we are responsible for staining our insured's side of the fence. And because there's two sides, we would pay for 100% of that stain, even though we may only be paying for 50% of the fence damage. So just keep that in mind. The other thing real quick on fence stain, you probably already know this. We're getting off topic a little bit, but since we are talking about fencing and stain, keep an idea and a lookout for fence splat or spatter. If you're not familiar with that term, spatter can be seen on various different types of materials on a property. It is hail that has hit a material but has not actually physically damaged the material in any way, but basically it's cleaned it. It's knocked off any of the dirt or oxidation that may be existing on that material. You'll see that often on wood fencing. In other words, you'll look at the fence, maybe it's stained, maybe it's not stained, and you see all these marks all over it. And you go up and look at these marks, and they're not damaged. It's not damaging the wood in any way. It's not fraying the wood. It's not denting the wood. You may see it on metal. For instance, garage doors is very common. You'll see spatter. Oxidation builds up on the doors. Hail hits it. It doesn't damage or dent the door, but you'll see marks all over it, spatter marks. Spatter marks are something we do not pay for. It's actually cleaning the oxidation or any kind of buildup, so it's not damaging the actual material, so we can't pay for it. But also, spatter marks are good to take photos of, obviously, to show that there's no damage. We want to document that, let everybody know that we have addressed it and looked at it, because the insured and contractors often may try to say that spatter marks are damage or hail damage. We want to identify that, photograph it, show that it's spatter, and indicate that it is not covered. However, another good thing about spatter is it gives you an indication of some information on the hail. For instance, how big the hail was by looking at the spatter marks, what direction the hail came from. In other words, if you see a ton of spatter marks here on this right run, and not very many on the back, and even less and few on this left run, well, that's a good indication that the storm and the hail and the wind came from the left to the right. So the hail was blown in and really hammered this run right here with a lot of spatter mark, maybe damage, but we're talking about spatter at this point. And then as it blew in, yeah, some of it got in and clipped the stain or something on this back run, so we might see some spatter and skid marking, but this side of the insurance fence has little damage on it. Of course, the other side, the neighbor's property side of the fence, would be similar to our insured side over here. It would be inundated with spatter marks. So that would be a good indication of which direction the storm and the hail came from. So keep it in mind, spatter is not going to be typically covered under policy, but it can give you valuable information that you may need during your scope of the property. Okay, so let's go take a look at the estimate real quick. I've already sort of started a little room here down in our fencing room. Again, get with your manager. These are general concepts with most carriers. We're talking about ownership and how to write these, putting notes in. Generally, this comes from AmFam and AFIX side of adjusting with our firm. Check with your manager to make sure some of this still applies. If you're not sure about co-ownership and ownership of fencing and how that carrier handles that and how they want you to write that. I always think it's a good idea if the carrier allows you to use F9 notes to put these on fencing line items or in rooms so that it can explain to the insured and their contractor what's going on with the fencing, whether we're dealing with ownership or not. So in this case, I have a little text note here that says the following line item accounts for repairs to the front, right, back, and left fence runs. The front, right, back, and left are co-owned. Therefore, line items for the runs reflect 50% of the total damage. The front, right, back, and left runs are owned by the insured. Now, this seems a little confusing, but what this is a default text note that I have in macros that we send out to our affix adjusters, and it has all the necessary information in it that you will need to edit. They're placeholders. That's why there's all this information. It's not going to necessarily apply to your loss, but it's here so that you don't have to type a bunch of this stuff in, and you can just edit this text note according to your loss. So we know that we're going to repair the front and the right and the back. But remember, the front and the right are owned by the insured. So let's edit this properly. So following line items account for repairs to the front, right, and back. So let's change this to say and back. We're going to take the left run out because we'll deal with that on another text note on the replacement. Now we're talking about ownership. So we're telling the insured and their contractor what we're doing. We're repairing these runs. Now we're going to tell them about ownership. The front and the right runs that are, remember, owned by the insured. So let's change it. That's the bottom note, the bottom sentence. The front, right, back, and left runs are owned by the insured. Well, let's change that. We know it's the front and the right. The front and right are owned by the insured. So let's just delete out. And there, we're good to go. Get that little comma out. Okay, good. And now we will change the little note for the back. That's co-owned. So we're going to delete out all the other runs in this sentence except the back. And let's change this to the, take out the plural. This is singular. The back run is, not are. Let's get all of our text correct. So let's read it. The following line items account for repairs to the front, right, and back runs. Yes, that's correct. We are repairing those runs. The back run is co-owned. Therefore, line items for this run, that's why we're reading this. You always want to check your work. Reflects 50% of the total damage. The front and right runs are co-owned by the insured. Are owned by the insured. Okay, so now that's our text note. It tells everybody what we're doing. We're repairing those 3 runs. It explains that 2 of the runs, the front and the right, are owned by the insured, and that the back is co-owned by the insured, and therefore we're only paying for 50% of the back damage. Now, we don't really have any set damages right here. We're just going to throw some numbers at this. So let's say on the front, we just had some wood slats. I'm going to write some notes down real quick. Let me grab a notepad. And we'll say, so slats is an example. Let's take all this out. We're not doing any 2x4s, posts, or anything. We're just going to say on the front runs, all we had was some slat damage. We're going to replace some slats. So let's say on the front, there's 4 slats. I'm just picking numbers here. Then let's say on the right, we had 8 slats, and we had 8 lineal feet of fence damage. So we had a little 8-foot section that blew down, let's say, or broke a post or something. Okay, so, and then the back, we have, let's say, a total of 12 slats, but remember that's co-owned. So we're only going to pay for 6 slats. And then let's say in the back we had, let's say we had 24 feet of fence that got blown down or damaged in addition to the slats. But remember, we're going to pay for half of that. So 12 feet of fencing. Okay, so now we got all our stuff written down. So let's add all that up. We've got 4 slats on the front total. We're paying for all that. 8 slats on the right. We're paying for all of that because it's owned by the insured. 12 slats on the back, but we're only paying for 50% of that. That's 6. So we add all our slats up. That is 18 slats total. And then on the right run, we're paying for 8 lineal feet of fencing. That's all the damages, but we're going to pay for 100% of that. The right is owned by the insured. The back, we had 24 feet, but we're going to only pay for 12. So we have now a total of 20 feet of fencing. So let's go ahead. Now that's what we're going to write in our line items, but let's get our text notes correct. So the front had 4 slats. The right had 4 slats. And no 2x4s or anything. We're just replacing that fencing on the right. Remember, that was 8 lineal feet of fencing. The back, we have 12 feet of fencing. And then we had 6 slats, because we had 12 slats total, but we're only paying for 50% on the back, so 6 slats. And then we're going to delete the left out completely because we're going to be dealing with that on another section right below this for a full replacement of the run. Okay, so let's delete this. And now we are good to go. So again, this is pretty easy once you understand the ownership and once you get your text notes set up right. Again, check with your manager to see how they want you to notate this kind of stuff and how this carrier deals with ownership. But if you do deal with ownership, you may check with your manager and see how the carrier wants you to handle any F9 notes to help explain this to the insured and their contractor. If you don't, in my opinion, you'll just write line items, and if you are dealing with co-ownership and ownership, but it doesn't delineate this out in a note, the insured and the contractor are going to get confused with the numbers that you're putting in your line items that you're actually paying for, because the contractor and both of them are going to have different numbers than you are. So the notes would help explain why the numbers are different. So again, check with your manager on that. Okay, so that's done. And now we're going to go to our second little text note here. The following line items count for replacing, not repairing, replacing the left run. This is another F9 note that's built into the fencing macro that we use on the AFIX side. Again, all of it's here for you to just edit. That's all we're doing, taking all that out. We don't need to deal with the front, right, and back runs. We've already dealt with all that. We do need to deal with the left run on ownership. This is co-owned, and this second sentence in this macro is dealing with co-ownership. So let's change this just to say the left run is co-owned. We're doing the same thing we did in the other text note. We're editing the note to accurately reflect what we're doing on these runs. The line items for the runs, this run, get our grammar correct, reflects 50% of the total damage. Now we're saying the front, right, back, and left are owned. We've already dealt with all the other sides, all the ownership. We do not need this anymore. So we're left with the following line items account for replacing the left fence run or runs. We can take this out, make it singular. The left run is co-owned, therefore the line items for this run reflect 50% of the total damage. We're really only dealing with one type of line item, so you could change these plural designations of the line item to line item. The line item for this run, the following line item, if you want to do it correctly. And then we don't need to put any numbers in for these different runs. Why? Because we've already designated what the other 3 runs are doing and their damages. And this deals with just this run, the left run. And whatever number we put in here is already telling them it's only 50% of the damages on that run. So we don't need to be redundant. You can if you want to. You just don't need to put in a number here on the left run. It will be reflected in the line item itself. The only time you need to have these multiples here with separate measurements is when you're dealing with more than one run or more than one side of the house, for instance, if you're dealing with siding, for instance. In this case, we're just dealing with one side. That would be reflected in the actual line item. Delete all that out. We're good to go. Okay. So let's go in and put our numbers in. We had 18 slats. This is on the front, right, and back again. We're going back and putting our numbers in. 18 slats. We had 20 feet of fencing. No gate. We'll just take the gate out. 20 feet of fencing. And let's say the fence was 10 years old. We'll put 10 years on the slats as well. And then 10 years old on the left run replacement, and we're at 25 feet total because the whole fence was 50 feet. Remember, we're paying for half. Now we're going to stain all of the fencing, and we're going to stain, remember, the front and the back of the front fencing. We're going to stain rather the inside and the outside of the front. That's owned by the insured. We're replacing slats on that front, remember? So if we put new slats in and the front or the inside and outside of that fence were both stained, let's say it was, we would now owe to stain both sides of that front fence to match it up, and then only the insides of the other fencing. So let's go back and take a look at this. So the front two fences are 8 feet. Then we have 50 foot, 50 foot, and 41.17 or 40 foot, 41 foot 2 inches. Okay, so let's add all this up real quick. So we have 16 feet in the front, but we're going to double that because remember, we're going to stain both sides. So 32 in the front, plus 50 on the right, plus 41.17 in the back, plus 50 on the left. That is our total lineal foot of fencing we're going to stain times 6 feet tall. It's a 6-foot wood fence, so we're going to stain 1,039 feet. So let's go back and write that. Go back to our fencing room. Here's our stain. 1039, and then we'll say the fencing stain is 10 years old as well. And now we are complete. However, look at this right here. Coverage A dwelling. Something you always want to pay attention to. This shouldn't be on the dwelling coverage. Of course, you probably already caught this if you were looking. This should be on, if you're dealing with standard ISO policies, coverage B, other structures. In this case, we're dealing with American Family, which is going to be a different coverage. So let's global change this. Do our global changes. We want to change coverage to coverage A dwelling extensions. This is a little bit different. As you can see, for American Family, they call their coverage B other structures, coverage A dwelling extensions. It's the same thing, basically. They just use a different name. Their coverage B is personal property. This is on their classic policies. So let's change it to coverage A dwelling extensions. That's the correct coverage for fencing. We've got our numbers in. We've got our depreciations in. We've got our text notes edited, reflecting everything perfectly. We are done. So I hope that makes sense on dealing with fencing and ownership. It's something a lot of adjusters may or may not be aware of, but it's something we do need to address in the field when we're dealing with fencing. Again, check with your manager, your account manager, on the claims you have, just to verify some of this of how that particular carrier deals with ownership of fencing and how they want it written in the estimate. Thanks again. I hope you have a great day. We'll see you on the next video. Take care.